So this talk is on the pros and cons of legumes in the rotation. The take-homes are that legumes create an opportunity to reduce N fertilizer spend in the subsequent crop. Mineral N soil sampling after the legume will help account for what is immediately available for the next crop following a legume. But capturing the extra N that is made available from the residue is also possible. Each system is different, and this does require some thought and some testing. So we know that legumes fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, and then when the legumes decompose, they release that nitrogen. And other crops in the rotation can take up that released N. Farmers are looking for opportunities in intensive arable rotations to access that free nitrogen supply. And there are lots of ways that legumes are included in the rotation. I just wanted to start off with this table of yield results from an example of a short-term cover crop of a favoured bean. It makes a couple of nice points, and one is that it only took 9 weeks for the nitrogen supply to really significantly improve the yield of the subsequent barley crop. The test from this trial had some strips where there was a control and no fertilizer applied. So the barley following the beans that were incorporated resulted in a 4.3 tonne per hectare increase in yield based on that nitrogen supply, which equates to about 75 kgs of nitrogen per hectare. And interestingly, if you also look at where the standard rate of nitrogen was applied, with and without following the short-term favour cover crop, there was also a yield bump of about 3.5 tonnes. I just wanted to make the point here that it's not an absolute game when it comes to legumes and nitrogen. Adding an extra 75 kgs of N from the bag wouldn't necessarily have resulted in that yield increase. Oftentimes it may be that it's the timing of the release of N from the legume residue breaking down that can lead to a yield increase over and above what can be accounted for by the absolute N rate. So what I'm going to focus on in this talk is really how we can think about factoring in the N supplies to get the best bang for buck in the subsequent crop. So in the first instance, we know that we can do the soil mineral N testing and factor that result into the FERT application for that next crop. It's also really useful to do your potentially mineralizable N test, which is going to tell you how much N will be made available over the growing season that comes from the soil organic matter. And as I've said, with legumes, there's also the release from the residue. It's not captured by either of these two soil tests. And this release from the residue can be substantial. So to factor it in as best you can, the first port of call is to do that soil testing and utilize either the soil calculator or whatever mass balance supply decision-making support you use. The soil calculator on the FAR website is a really quick and easy tool to figure out how much nitrogen your crop needs based on your expected yields, and then to plug in the results from the lab with regards to your PMN and mineral N, and it can factor in, let you know how much fertilizer is required. The calculator has what we call a confidence factor, where you get to say, plug in how much you want to rely on that soil in your fertilizer decision making as you start to build up your confidence to utilize soil in. When it comes to legumes, you can be absolutely confident to put in 100% confidence in factoring in that soil supply. And the reason is, as I've already said, there's going to be this extra release of nitrogen from the residue as the legume residue breaks down in that next crop, which isn't accounted for in the calculator. But if you want to go further and really hone in and getting a more accurate number for the release of nitrogen from that residue, you can track it in that next crop following the legume. A really quick and easy way to do that is with the quick N test. This is really cheap. It does take a little bit of effort to go out and take the soil sample, and then you can do it yourself through following the simple instructions on, if you go to the quick N test on the FAR website, you'll find the how-to and where to get the test from. This enables you to actually see for yourself how much nitrogen is released after the legume in the next crop. You can really build your confidence about what to expect in terms of that additional N supply. And the reason why you do want to get a handle on this for your own system is that not all systems are the same. The amount of nitrogen that's going to be made available from that legume will vary, and the timing of that availability will also vary. Just going to run through a few examples of what I mean by this from some trial work. The first example is wheat following peas. This was a Canterbury trial, and in this instance, there was an extra 68 kgs of N that was made available for the wheat crop following the peas compared to the non-legume prior crop. In this instance, most of this was made available upfront for the wheat, and 30% was released from that residue breakdown. Now, another example, this is wheat following a clover seed crop. There was an additional 200 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare that was made available for the wheat. 40% of this was immediately available, and you can see on the graph to the right, that is what was measured with the soil mineral N test. It's the red part of that bar graph, the N available bar graph. And this was factored into the fertiliser decisions that the farmer was making. There was, however, an additional 120 kilograms that was released from the residue across the growing season that wasn't accounted for in decision making. And in this instance, that amounted to about $2 at $2 per kg of N, at around $200 per hectare that could have been saved. Okay, so a third example. This is a maize following vetch example in the North Island, and here we have an additional 170 kgs of N per hectare made available for the maize following the legume winter crop compared to an annual ryegrass winter crop. 30% of this was immediately available for the maize in that September monitoring, but additional nitrogen was released across the growing season. In this particular trial, the yields following the vetch were actually significantly greater than the maize yields following the ryegrass. And just crunching the numbers for that looked like $198 per hectare spend on fertiliser in the vetch compared to $428 following the ryegrass, and there was also greater yields following the vetch. A really important point to make here is that it's not just about the back pockets. If you don't utilise that nitrogen following the legume, you can actually set yourself up to having really high residual Ns going into winter. So the residual Ns, that's another quick test that you can do either yourself with the quick N or take a sample and send it off to the lab just to check in how you did that season with your decision making following a legume. If your numbers are high and you've got a lot of nitrogen left in the soil after harvest, then it might give you pause to think about how you might change your decision making or modify things slightly next time round. In this example here, we have the trial coming from that previous graph where we have maize following either vetch or annual ryegrass. And there's three treatments of the nitrogen that was applied to the maize. The one I want to draw your attention to is following the vetch, where we have this GMP, i.e. your good management practice treatments. And this was where the rate of nitrogen applied to the maize factored in the soil N. And comparing this to the high treatment, N treatment, this is where the nitrogen applied to the maize did not factor in that soil N. You can really see the difference there in how much nitrogen is left unutilized following maize harvest where that soil N is not accounted for, comparing the 216 kgs of N left in the profile compared to 91. That 91 is still high, and that's because there was that extra nitrogen that was released from the residue of the veg that wasn't taken into account in the GMP treatment, because the GMP treatment just factored in the mineral N and the nitrogen released from the soil organic matter. Another way to approach this is to start factoring in the residue N for your system, is to actually do some small area farm tests on your own farm. In this example, the farmer had 3 different farm strips with some different fertilizer rates. And this was maize following a crimson clover. One strip had no head starter or side dressing. The other strip just had starter, and the other one just had starter and a side dress of nitrogen. And what he found was that he didn't actually need to apply any fertilizer to the maize after the clover in his system. But again, it's a matter of building your own data sets on your own system, on your own farm, so that you can fine-tune decisions that work for you in your system. And finally, intercropping can supply nitrogen in season as well as for the next crop. The focus of this talk has been supplying nitrogen to the subsequent crop, but there's also a lot of interest, particularly internationally, on bringing that legume in alongside the main crop. There are challenges to intercropping, and in this example, it comes from Germany, where they currently have 60,000 hectares of bean and maize grown together. And the driver here is the end caps that they're having to deal with. Having the beans with the maize means that they can get the yields they're after with the reduced nitrogen rates that they're allowed to apply to the maize. There's also other advantages around high protein feeds, but as I said, there are challenges with intercropping that need to be addressed to make this work. So the take homes here is that free nitrogen is only free if you factor it into your fertilizer decision making. Soil testing will help account for what is immediately available following a legume, but to capture that extra N from the residue, it can be done, but it does require some in-season nitrogen testing and can be fine-tuned with on-farm tryouts.